You're listening to the Advocast, presented and produced by the Advocates for Human Rights.
Welcome, everyone, to the Advocates for Human Rights CLE in commemoration of Ida Hobbit, which is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. Ida Hobbit has been celebrated on or around May 17th every year since 2004. And now Ida Hobbit is observed in 130 countries, including 37 where consensual same-sex sexual activity is illegal. Ida Hobbit itself celebrates the decision of the World Health Organization to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness, which happened on May 17th, 1990. My name is Nathan Madsen. I'm the managing attorney for international justice at the Advocates for Human Rights, and I'm also our organization's focal person for LGBTIQ plus human rights. In the next hour, I'm going to be providing a high-level overview of where international human rights law comes from and how it has been used to address LGBTIQ plus issues. And I'm also going to dive a bit deeper into the Universal Periodic Review, or the UPR, and how LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders have used the UPR to advance LGBTIQ plus rights. Next, I'm going to address the upcoming UPR of the United States and how the Advocates plans to use this mechanism to raise LGBTIQ plus issues. And then I'm going to invite our panelists, Kaleem Ali, a Caribbean human rights defender and an attorney at law from Trinidad and Tobago, and Lily Ansell, an associate at Faegre Drinker, about their experiences using the UPR to address LGBTIQ plus issues and their recent in-person advocacy in Geneva. The Advocates has a long history of representing individuals seeking asylum on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics through our Immigration Legal Services Program. Our Women's Human Rights Program and our Domestic Policy Program have also worked with LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders. But the team that I'm in, International Justice, really focuses on engaging with the United Nations and other international and regional human rights mechanisms and bringing LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders to those spaces. We also are members of the International LGBTI Association, or ILGA, and we've partnered with a global network of human rights defenders, and sometimes we will also use our LGBTIQ plus clients' information with their permission in our reports. So now we're going to look a bit more closely at some of the foundations of international human rights law and the ways in which LGBTIQ plus issues have been incorporated into this legal framework. At the United Nations, some of the sources of international human rights law include treaty law, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a non-binding declaration of human rights principles, but has largely been accepted as customary international law at this point. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR, which produces opinions and interpretations of human rights law. The Human Rights Council, which is a body of 47 member states of the United Nations. But it's not just the member states themselves that are elected to the council that participate in council business. And then the General Assembly, which is the convening body in New York of all UN member states. But this body is not exclusively working on human rights. These five mechanisms all produce human rights law in different ways, but the two that the advocates most oftentimes engage with are treaty law and the Human Rights Council, because they provide an opportunity for non-governmental organizations or NGOs like ourselves to participate. When we're engaging with treaty law, for example, we oftentimes are helping the treaty monitoring bodies assess whether a country under review is meeting its obligations under the treaty by submitting shadow reports to the treaty monitoring body on the human rights situation on the ground. We also participate in the general comment process by providing the treaty monitoring bodies with our input on how treaties should be interpreted. The special procedures are created by the Human Rights Council under specific mandates to either investigate particular themes like sexual orientation and gender identity, torture, or human rights defenders, or to investigate particular countries. The mandate holders solicit feedback from NGOs. They make country visits and they write reports on themes covered by their mandates. The independent expert on SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender identity, is the mandate holder that is particularly dedicated to working on LGBTIQ plus human rights. But many other of the mandate holders have worked on or incorporate LGBTIQ plus issues into their reports. For example, the Special Rapporteur on Torture has said that a state's refusal to allow transgender people to change their legal gender is a violation of their human rights, and it limits transgender people's enjoyment of human rights, including access to healthcare, employment, and education. The Universal Periodic Review is not created by the Human Rights Council, but it does meet in the Council's room, and many aspects of the UPR happen within the Council. But we'll be talking more about the UPR in just a moment. And then lastly, although it's not an official source of human rights law, I want to draw your attention to the Yogyakarta Principles and the Yogyakarta Principles Plus 10, which are two sets of interpretations of human rights law and provide guidance on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. And the reason why these are important is because, unfortunately, none of the human rights treaties which form the basis of the human rights legal system directly relate to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. But LGBTIQ plus people are still owed all of the human rights found in these treaties, and the Yogyakarta Principles provide clear guidance on how these human rights, such as the right to privacy or the right to recognition before the law, can and should be applied to LGBTIQ plus specific needs. So for example, the Yogyakarta Principles say that the right to privacy means that states should not criminalize consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults, nor should it force individuals to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity. The Yogyakarta Principles also say that the right to recognition before the law means that the state should not consider LGBTIQ plus people as having diminished legal capacity solely because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that is a very high-level overview of human rights at the UN, but I do want to dive a little bit deeper on the Universal Periodic Review because that's the focus of today's presentation. So as I mentioned before, the Universal Periodic Review, or the UPR, happens within the Human Rights Council room, which is this room here on the left with the colorful ceiling. It's a review that happens to every UN member state, and it happens roughly every 5 years. So although the entire process itself is a review, the actual point in time where the country under review is in the quote unquote hot seat is during the interactive dialogue, which is when the country under review, for example, the United States, goes to Geneva in Switzerland with a government delegation and they make a presentation of their human rights record. And then every other member state, if they want to, can sign up to comment on the United States' human rights record and make recommendations. After the United States has received all of these recommendations, it then needs to choose whether it's going to accept the recommendations or note the recommendations. And here, note is a particular UN term of art that means rejecting a recommendation. So what makes the UPR an incredibly useful tool is to produce change is because all human rights issues are fair game. So some countries, again, like the United States, does not sign many treaties. And so it's rarely up for review by treaty body committees. The UPR, however, allows any country to raise any human rights issue with the United States, regardless of what treaties the US has signed. Because this is a state-driven process and diplomats are the ones who are actually making the recommendations, the UPR is also a very political process this complements some of the other UN human rights mechanisms which are driven by experts. So again, as I mentioned, this is a 5-year cycle, and where states and NGOs move through multiple different stages of the cycle. So one being the preparation of information for review, then the interactive dialogue, then the adoption of the report, and then the implementation of recommendations. And this process happens roughly within a 5-year period. But I want to drill down a little bit deeper and look at the ways in which UPR advocacy has been used to make change. So in March 2024, I was working with one of our partners, the House of Garamali, which is an organization of Ethiopian LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders that are primarily located in the diaspora, on a report on LGBTIQ plus rights in Ethiopia. And one of the recommendations that we suggested states make to the government of Ethiopia was to combat prejudice, stigma, and violence against LGBTIQ plus people through education. As part of our advocacy, we emailed our reports and shorter synopses of our reports to countries that we knew were friendly to LGBTIQ plus rights, like Norway. And although we can't say for certain that the Norwegian government used our specific recommendation, because it's not verbatim the same recommendation that appeared in our report, it is similar enough to our recommendation that we can infer that we likely influenced the recommendation. Unfortunately, Ethiopia rejected or noted that recommendation, the specific one that's on the screen, but then actually rejected all recommendations pertaining to LGBTIQ plus issues, saying that, quote, Ethiopia believes that same-sex sexual relations is a conduct against deeply embedded cultural and religious beliefs of the society, end quote. So even though Ethiopia rejected the recommendation, we were able to still contribute to the human rights record of Ethiopia, and we made note of the violations LGBTIQ plus people experience. And it's also allowed our partners to tell their stories to diplomats who took them seriously. On a more positive note, we can look at Mexico. The other example that I have on the screen, that advocates did not submit a report on LGBTIQ plus human rights in Mexico, but it still provides a really excellent example of the ways in which the UPR can influence change on the ground, which is the ultimate goal, is to change things, the daily lives and conditions for LGBTIQ plus people on the ground. So during its 2024 review, Mexico received this recommendation from Chile, which it accepted, and it has already begun to implement. So since the UPR happened, at least 3 states in Mexico have had legislation advance or passed that permit transgender people to change their legal gender. And 2 states, Baja California and Baja California Sur, have also passed legislation that permits transgender adolescents to change their legal gender. So these new laws legally recognizing transgender people as their gender identity have also likely increased advocacy around trans femicides, so the killings of transgender women and protections for transgender women. So it's always important to remember that these are tools, and these tools can hopefully produce change on the ground, but that's not the only reason why we engage with the UPR. Now I want to shift focus a little bit to the United States. So the United States is up for review. It should be going through the interactive dialogue in either October or November of 2025, so this fall. And as I said, this is an opportunity for all the other countries of the world, if they want to sign up to make recommendations to the United States. And we can expect that once the United States does go through this review, a lot of countries are going to sign up because a lot of countries are going to want to make recommendations to the US. And the Advocates has already been deeply involved in this UPR process. Some of that involvement has included submitting several stakeholder reports as part of the US UPR during the preparation of information for review stage. But one topic that we have not submitted a report on was LGBTIQ plus human rights. And the reason why is because our partners, which are Minnesota-based organizations and leaders in the LGBTIQ plus community, did not feel that a report, which was due in April, was going to be relevant by the time that we actually do our electronic and in-person advocacy in September, because the current administration's policies are quickly changing the landscape for LGBTIQ plus rights. So instead, what we've been doing is we've been gathering together a diverse coalition of LGBTIQ plus leaders to prepare a more tailored advocacy tools later this summer, so that when we are doing our electronic and in-person advocacy, that they're as fresh and relevant as possible. And once we start doing that advocacy work, we're going to begin contacting Human Rights Council delegates to set up meetings and explain why it is important for their governments to make recommendations on LGBTIQ plus issues. And then this fall, the US government should go through the interactive dialogue process, where we expect the current administration is unfortunately not going to accept many LGBTIQ plus recommendations, but we can, however, still utilize what happens at the UPR to push for changes at the state and local levels, especially given that Minnesota prides itself on being a leader in LGBTIQ plus rights protection. So that was a lot of conversation for me, but now I want to turn it over to the stars of today's CLE, Kaleem Ali, who again is a Caribbean human rights defender and an attorney at law in Trinidad and Tobago. He's a long-term partner of the Advocates, and he's worked on numerous reports on LGBTIQ plus human rights and abolition of the death penalty in the Caribbean. Also with us is Lily Ansell, who is an associate at Favorite Drinker, and she has been a volunteer with the Advocates for just about a year. So first, I would love it if each of you could tell me about your experiences with the UPR process. Kaleem, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I've engaged with not just the UPR process, but several mechanisms across the UN system over the past 2 years with the Advocates for Human Rights. And it's been an eye-opening process, one to learn about and to immerse myself in. But it is truly a way in which a lot of smaller countries that often get ignored in the general global way of things kind of get a spotlight placed on them, and so that it allows for some level of accountability. I've had the opportunity to go to Geneva twice with the Advocates and do in-person lobbying with delegates and meeting, and it's always so interesting when you start educating them about what is happening on the ground in respective countries, how you kind of see like the little spark in their eye as they become exposed to this information, because it's not something that their own internal research teams may have come across, or it may not have been a priority area that they would have necessarily considered. And I've engaged with that process from the start in terms of preparing these reports on specific countries, and then working on one-pagers which summarize very nicely what the situation is in that respective country, to meeting with the delegates and lobbying the delegates on those specific recommendations, and then seeing in some circumstances recommendations being made. So it's nice to experience the process full circle. And my experience has been a great one. I've been able to do a lot of advocacy and outreach on Caribbean countries, which often get either neglected because we get lumped in with Latin America, and so a lot of the focus tends to be on Latin America, and the Caribbean gets excluded. And I've also been able, to shed lights on issues within my own country, which for me was something that was particularly fulfilling. I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later on, but Lily, I'll defer to you now to talk about your experience.
Thank you. So as Nathan mentioned, I've worked with the Advocates for about a year now. My journey with them started in about July of last year, where we did a research event for LGBTIQ plus rights in various countries, which was aimed at gathering information for the stakeholder reports that the advocates and their partners were going to submit. So I attended that event and then went on to write the report for Lesotho. After working with the advocates and our partner in Lesotho, we trimmed down the report and made a one-pager, the synopsis that Nathan had mentioned, that we then used on the ground in Geneva to advocate for LGBTIQ plus rights in Lesotho. Unfortunately, when we went to Geneva, our partner in Lesotho wasn't able to attend. So I attended meetings with delegates and advocated for the points that our partner really wanted us to make on the ground. One of the main ones being establishing a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles, with the ultimate goal of that being to have a independent system for people to report abuses, and then that system and the institution can review and investigate the reported incidences.
Great, thank you so much. And Lillian and Kaleem's participation in the UPR processes are somewhat similar, but of course they're also tailored specifically to the countries that they've reported on. And as Kaleem mentioned, the UPR is not the only process that he engages with as well. And so maybe Kaleem, I'll turn to you and I'll ask, how has the UPR process, given that this is the focus of today's topic, how has the UPR process helped to make real change in the Caribbean?
Sure. So what I want to rephrase that a little bit by saying, how has an informed UPR process made change in the Caribbean? Traditionally, a lot of, even though the member states do make their recommendations, they make recommendations based off of what their internal research teams, either in Geneva or at host country or home government, would do on a country that is up for review, and they would develop recommendations in line with that. The problem with that has been that traditionally the Caribbean has enjoyed, I don't want to use the word impunity, but a certain, for lack of a better word, a certain degree of impunity. Am I freezing? Nathan, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Oh, okay. So, and that really is because there's a gross lack of underreporting of human rights issues in the Caribbean, because there is not the financial incentive, the technical capability, or any sort of state investment or resourcing, or even independent investment and resourcing into Caribbean countries to develop those competencies to do reporting on an independent level, to engage in that sort of advocacy. And so, because these representatives and their interns and their researchers are doing research based on what is available online, a lot of the information that they get is either very outdated and actually paints a nicer image than what the present reality might be, or there's just no information at all, and so they don't make recommendations on a country if it comes up. And so, having had the opportunity with the advocates to engage on the ground over Zoom calls, over email with members as well, has allowed for that direct exchange of information, of data. I have partners in several Caribbean countries. I have, persons who are within the community who've suffered several injustices, and they're willing to put that information or share that information with me, and then I, as a conduit, relay that information over to the representatives of the various member states. And what I've seen since I've started doing that work is more recommendations being advanced that are up to date and relevant. And so it allows for a certain degree of accountability. I mean, not talking about the UPR, but I remember when my country went before the council, Trinidad and Tobago went before the council, I remember seeing the representative from the state talking about, how positive things are in Trinidad. And then one of the members of the council literally, asked this question, okay, but you are saying this, but civil society is telling us otherwise, or this is what we are hearing from persons on the ground. And I actually saw representatives from my government get flustered and not know how to respond in real time because they had grown so accustomed to not being held accountable because of that lack of data and that lack of information. And so I think that's how I've really seen the change. It's facilitated an informed process at the UPR through other mechanisms as well, which instills a certain level of accountability.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your point about firsthand information coming from people that are on the ground and experiencing these violations is really critical, because at the end of the day, whether it's the German government making a recommendation, or the Canadian government making a recommendation, or the South African government making a recommendation, they can Google a country. They can, type into a search engine LGBTIQ plus rights in St. Kitts and Nevis, which is a report that Kaleem and I are currently working on. And there's not going to be a lot of information that pops up, or it's going to, as Kaleem said, be quite old. But what's really important is Kaleem's outreach to people who are in the country and say, hey, this report is being produced. We want to make sure that your voices are being heard. We want to make sure that your issues are being talked about. So please, as much as you feel comfortable doing so, give me this information so that we can ensure that LGBTIQ plus rights are being discussed, and that the issues that you want to have be brought forward get brought forward. And so I think that's just a really wonderful example. Thank you, Kaleem. So Lily, you don't come from a human rights perspective in the same way that Kaleem does, but you are a lawyer. You are you work at a major law firm, but this kind of work, it's not necessarily similar to the daily work that you're doing at your firm. So, for the lawyers that are in this call who are thinking, how could I get involved, or what ways could I step up for LGBTIQ plus rights? What sorts of skills did you draw on to be a successful advocate for LGBTIQ plus human rights?
Yeah, so I was definitely, a little nervous about that going in, especially on the ground in Geneva, just because I'm a transactional real estate lawyer. Not only am I not doing human rights work on a day-to-day, I'm also not going to trial and presenting in front of a judge or jury. It's a very different type of law. So I was a little nervous, but as I got into it, I realized it really is basic lawyering skills that are transferable from a transactional practice, a civil litigation practice, a criminal litigation practice that you can use in advocacy. So starting with a stakeholder report, for example, the basic skills you need are research and writing skills, which you're taught in law school. Some of you may do more research in a day-to-day than I do, but it's still the basic skills of finding relevant, trustworthy, and credible information. Where we have a partner that can provide firsthand information and firsthand accounts, obviously we want to use that in the reports. If not, just checking sources and making sure they are legitimate and finding items and stories that are really relevant to what we're advocating for. And then I think on the ground in Geneva, I would say, and also in writing a stakeholder report, is really knowing your audience. So whether it's meeting with delegates from countries that are going to make recommendations to the country under review, and knowing, where they stand on LGBTIQ plus rights. If they're really strong, we might make recommendations that are a little more progressive. If they're not as strong, maybe we would do an important recommendation, but maybe would be seen as less progressive, like the National Human Rights Institution. And I think that's beneficial because, as we saw in this UPR cycle, a lot of the countries that you wouldn't necessarily consider or traditionally think of being really strong on LGBTIQ plus rights did make the recommendation related to a national human rights institution. And then also knowing the country that's being reviewed and knowing where they stand so you can make relevant recommendations that they might actually consider accepting and implementing. And then I think the final thing, and probably the most important, is to remember that we're not going in as pro bono lawyers trying to make recommendations that we think are important. We're going in with our client being the advocates and, more importantly, the partner organization, and making the recommendations that are most important to them on the ground that will make an actual impact in their country. So I think a lot of the skills are transferable. It's just the way you look at it and, how you proceed from there.
Thank you, Lily. I think that's really helpful because, I talk to people all the time who say, I would love to volunteer with the Advocates, or I would love to get more involved in international human rights law, but I don't know how. Maybe that is specifically when you are trained in the US, you don't think about international human rights all that much, or you don't take as many courses, and it may be very different for lawyers who are trained outside of the US legal system. But it is important to remember that a lot of the skills that you've developed, even if your practice is incredibly local, even if your practice is only based in the US, that you have the skills that you can use to adapt. You definitely need to adapt a little bit, but that you already have those skills to successfully advocate on behalf of LGBTIQ plus people. But I did want to focus in on what you said about listening to people, listening to the partners, and really making sure that you are representing their voices. And this is something that I am incredibly happy that you took away from your volunteering with the Advocates. This is something that is incredibly important to the Advocates themselves, is that we have, I'll talk about myself. I won't talk about for my colleagues, but I'll talk about myself. I came to the Advocates with a background in both human rights law and the anthropology of human rights. And I had a strong background in working with queer and trans activists in Hong Kong. I do know a lot about that. I'm not going to know about what's happening necessarily in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not going to know about what's happening in Colombia. I'm not going to know what's happening in Iraq. What I do know is that I understand the human rights system, and I understand how to open doors for the people who are working in those countries, who are experiencing these human rights violations, and who have incredible expertise and lived experience that they want to share, that they want to have people at the United Nations grappling with. And so it's important for me to go into interactions with these other human rights defenders, and this is really, what you did as well, Lily, is to say, what is it that you want to focus on? What are your goals here? And how could we use these systems at the United Nations, whether it's the UPR, whether it's something else, how can we use these systems, these tools, to help you achieve your goals? And really, when you're putting your clients first and foremost, and this is a skill that all lawyers have, whether you are, again, a transactional lawyer, whether you're a litigator, your job is to represent your clients zealously. And when you remember that when you're having a meeting with someone in Lesotho and you're saying, what are the major issues for you? What are you experiencing day to day? And what recommendations would you see as being the most important? They'll tell you. And then it's your job to just put that into action. I can't speak for Lily, but I would say that when I was communicating with our partners in Lesotho, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that a recommendation on a national human rights institution should be the primary recommendation that should be made. But that was their that was what they wanted. And so that's what Lilly did. And we saw a lot of countries make that recommendation. And we can only hope that the government of Lesotho will accept that recommendation and start implementing it. So final question, and this goes to both of you, but how would you suggest lawyers interested in LGBTIQ plus human rights get involved?
I would say the first part of my answer would be don't think on it too much, because when you think on it a bit too much, you might start thinking that you can't do this, or this is something that is completely foreign to you. And so, but like Lily mentioned, all of your skills are transferable and make a big difference. And it's very easy to get involved. You reach out to organizations like the Advocates, you reach out to any other organization that does work within the civil society space. But what I tend to recommend to people actually is to sit and think about a cause that they are passionate about, something that they could relate deeply to, whether it's something that, you know, affects them, affects their family, their friends, whatever the case may be, or just something that they may have some sort of passion for. And then start, you know, doing some research into organizations that work on those issues. And, you know, it's as simple as sending them an email, volunteering your time, volunteering your services, whatever the case may be. So that's one route in which a person could get involved. The second way in which a person could get involved is to also take the initiative and perhaps start your own civil society organization focused on a cause that you are passionate about, and connecting with other CSOs that work on similar causes and collaborating. You know, and that really is how it was for me in terms of I'd say I'm 26 years old, so I'm very young in this space when I go into UN spaces. But my first exposure to human rights was at university when I was doing my undergraduate degree in law. And one of my lecturers at the time, he was a member on the UN Human Rights Committee. And so he took five of us, and we clerked with him during the course of his tenure. And so he would send us cases that would come before the committee, things that would become for general comment, those sorts of things. And he would ask us to, he actually split us up, it's quite funny, into liberal and conservative. And he would have the liberal group and the conservative group would produce advisory notes or opinions on the same issue. And then he would look at the two and he would, you know, adjust accordingly. And that was really my first exposure to human rights law. And it was something that I genuinely fell in love with. But there wasn't any opportunity locally for me to get involved on an international level. So when I started working with a regional NGO that works on the death penalty, that's how I met the Advocates. And through that, I met Nathan and started doing work on the LGBTQI plus issues. And so I've been working on both the death penalty and LGBTQ plus issues. And now Nathan could tell you that I am currently in the process of trying to start my own initiative at home to kind of scale and develop competencies amongst attorneys here across the Caribbean to get them more involved. And so, like I said, it really is a matter of you sit down, you think about what you like, reach out to organizations, or you start your own organization and, you know, figure it out. It's something, being a lawyer, like today's session is about continuous learning. You'd never know everything. You would never know the answer from the beginning, but using the tools and the skills that you've been taught, you are able to figure it out as you go along. And there are always partners and other organizations that are there and willing to provide guidance once you reach out to them. So don't wait for them to find you. Go out, find them, and, you know, just give back.
I would just add quickly, the Advocates make it very easy to get involved. So if your firm has a pro bono group that you can work with to find opportunities, whether with the Advocates or another group, I think that's a really easy path for people who are busy and, you know, want to make a difference, but don't have as much time and experience to do some of the other steps. So I would say check with your firm and then check with the Advocates, because there are a lot of ways you can help, even with limited time.
Thank you both. So I want to turn it over to the audience, see if there are any questions. All right, we have a question. Do you ever face criticism that you're just pushing a quote unquote Western agenda when it comes, or by focusing on LGBTIQ plus human rights? Colleen, do you want to go first?
Yes, I definitely do face that criticism. In the Caribbean is still very much very conservative and very religious. And so a lot of these, human rights generally are perceived as being Western ideology that is being imposed onto the global South, and that it's this big agenda that is being pushed onto us, and we are the agents to facilitate said agenda. Definitely do get that criticism. And there's a Caribbean historian that I always quote, and she said it best when she said that when you take people who have historically been denied rights and then suddenly one day give them rights, how do they appreciate or see the value in rights expanding beyond what they were given initially? So it's very static and very slow when it comes to the jurisprudential development of human rights. And so when you come and you start talking about what the rest of the world is doing, or what I don't like the term developed world, but that's what people use. So when the developed world is doing this and we are not doing this, and you come to try to get your own country or get your own people involved in that, there's often that criticism that, you're just pushing a Western agenda that doesn't belong here. Some people go as far as saying LGBTQI and other, and they don't exist here, and that the emergence is the byproduct of American mainstream media, and there's a lot of criticism, definitely. But the important thing to remember is that the work that you are doing, even though it may be subjected to heavy criticism, has a significant impact. Even if that impact is on one person, the work that you do could literally be the difference between that one person, self-harming or not self-harming. And I don't mean to make it extreme, but that is the reality of the type of work that we do.
Thank you. Yeah, I will say, I do sometimes get that criticism. And, the criticism that Kaleem was talking about, he's coming from a country that I think we could say is in the global majority, which is the more neutral version of global South. And so that criticism is being lobbed against him from other people from there. I have a different perspective, being from the global minority, from the global North, that sometimes people see us involving ourselves in, for example, Trinidad and Tobago, as us in the global minority exporting a Western agenda to the global majority. And what I always say is that at the end of the day, we're not doing any kind of work unless we have partnerships with people on the ground, either on the ground or in the diaspora. So we're not submitting a report on Trinidad and Tobago unless we have a partner in Trinidad and Tobago who says, one, this kind of reporting makes sense for me and my advocacy goals, but two, that we have information that is more than what we can just Google. And so it's very important then that we are saying, this work is being done in collaboration with people from this country. And so we're not exporting a Western agenda. We're making sure that our partners' advocacy goals and desires are being uplifted in the United Nations. But the criticisms that Kaleem is getting, I don't get that criticism, but I understand why people who are actually in the country might get that kind of criticism, that it's just not like being LGBTIQ plus doesn't exist in Trinidad and Tobago, or it didn't until, the British were there, which we all know that that's not true, that there has always been sexual and gender diversity in every culture from the beginning of time, and that, in fact, some of the restrictions on sexual and gender diversity in some of these countries were the direct results of colonialism. But sometimes you just are not going to win. Like, people are going to criticize you and they're going to say that this is not right, this is amoral, this is a Western agenda. And sometimes you just can't win. And so sometimes it's about picking and choosing when you want to engage in those kinds of conversations. Okay, we have another question. It sounds like sometimes you work with countries, US included, that are unlikely to accept recommendations on LGBTIQ plus human rights. Is there a benefit to participating in the UPR process if the country receiving the recommendations is just going to reject them? I can start. I'll say absolutely. We participate in the UPR in part to make change on the ground, and that is something that we do try to keep as sort of like the finish line, is to make changes on the ground. But sometimes engaging in these kinds of mechanisms is also incredibly important for the human rights defenders to be able to speak truth to power, to be in the United Nations and have these conversations with delegates, or to testify in front of a committee, or to make an oral statement and to say, this is what is happening in my country. This is why this is a major issue. And that ability to tell their stories, and sometimes tell their stories for the absolute first time ever, because their country is so restrictive on LGBTIQ plus issues that they can't post about it on social media. They can't talk about it with friends and family. They can't create their own organization like Kaleem is talking about. They just can't. They live in secrecy. But this opportunity gives them the ability to be taken seriously, to have their concerns heard, and for actions to be taken regarding their concerns. And so if you think about it like that, yes, we want the country to accept the recommendations, and more importantly, we want the country to implement the recommendations. But just because they don't doesn't mean that it's been a waste of time. And that's just one example of how it's not.
I definitely agree with Nathan's sentiment. I think I understand coming from the Caribbean that change isn't something that is just going to come with the flip of a switch. It's not a light that you just turn on and then suddenly we have change. It's something that you have to strategically chisel away at and resist consistently until you wear down the oppressor, more or less. And so that this is a way in which human rights defenders and persons who've been silenced, oppressed, marginalized, excommunicated from their own countries resist the oppressor in these types of spaces and these types of fora. Because what happens is, if you don't have that, you have states who, like I said earlier, enjoy a level of impunity because of that lack of data reporting, that lack of, transparency and accountability that they've created to disguise and cover the atrocities that they commit. This is the opportunity by which you get to tell the global community, this is what is happening in this country. This is why you need to make recommendations. And those recommendations, regardless, the state has to reply. So they even if they just note it, it's still an acknowledgement that, somebody has said this. What is your response to it? And so even in this process, something in chiseling away, what we've also been doing recently is revising the type of recommendations that we make to chisel away at a faster rate and to make it seemingly impossible for states to note it. So I will give you my favorite example to give. Okay, if you're not willing to, give LGBTQ plus people rights because your justification is this is not what the majority of your population wants, let us put you to the test on that. So let's call for an education campaign or awareness campaign to sensitize people. And then at the end of it, do some sort of survey to track perceptions and attitudes of the population after being educated. I'm not asking you to do anything groundbreaking. I'm just asking you to educate your population. So if you're not willing to do that, that says a lot more about you as a country than it does say about people from civil society or human rights defenders. So it's not a process that, has no benefit. There's a lot of, but I think it falls to how you define benefit or how you view benefit. And to me, that benefit is a tool of resistance against a state or an entity that oppresses, marginalizes, whatever the case may be. And it is the opportunity by which people who are voiceless in their own countries have the ability to say, okay, well, if my government is not going to listen to me, I can make every other government in the world listen to me.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think you are spot on. All right, it looks like we have one last question, which is good because that means we're right on time. So the conversation has emphasized on the importance of firsthand information from people on the ground. My question is, how does the Advocates address safety concerns for partners? I can imagine that in some places it is dangerous to put your name on a report and identify yourself as an LGBTIQ plus human rights defender. Absolutely. There are so many different situations for people who are LGBTIQ plus, much less LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders. In some countries, it is completely fine to be open and public about your support of LGBTIQ plus rights and your activism. In other countries, that is absolutely not the case. When I say that we don't submit reports unless we have partner cooperation, that is completely true. That doesn't mean that our partners are always going to show up on our reports. Sometimes it is just unsafe for us to name an individual, like an individual person who has contributed to the report or an organization. It would make the situation so unsafe for them. So we work with them, we address their safety concerns, and we say, okay, maybe what we do is we just submit this under our name. Your information is still there. We anonymize it so that you are protected, but your organization name is not there, so that no one is going to come knocking and say, we saw that you submitted a report with this organization based in the United States on LGBTIQ plus rights, and start tracking your movements or tracking your funding or tracking anything like that. So we do take our partners' safety quite seriously. And then, when we bring partners to Geneva to do in-person advocacy, we also make sure that everybody who is participating, whether that is advocate staff like myself, whether that is advocates volunteers like Lily, or other partners like Kaleem, know, okay, so-and-so has a safety concern. They cannot be identified to their own country. So let's say we had a partner from Spain. If they have a safety concern, we're not going to tell the Spanish government, oh, we have someone here from Spain who is doing advocacy work. We just pretend that they don't exist if we are talking to Spain. We make sure that we are taking our partners' safety very seriously, because, well, we do, at least at this time in our history, enjoy a degree of safety and protection in the United States for dealing with these kinds of issues. Not everybody else does. And the last thing that we want to do is to cause harm to someone else in the name of human rights. So with that, I want to thank Kaleem and Lily for joining me today and for putting in so much time and effort into this CLE. I also want to thank my colleagues, Kristen Gill and Anthony Delazzi, for their assistance in planning this Ida Hobbit celebration with me. I want to thank you again for taking the past hour to spend with us. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the Advocast. If you want to learn more about our work, visit theadvocatesforhumanrights.org.